If we just learned about the first fossils on Earth, we're going to learn next, where did these things come from? And so we have a couple of ideas, but I tell you, they're in that stage still. You can't prove anything in science, okay? There's no such thing as proof. We make strong arguments based on the evidence that we see. So we make observations, we make interpretations, and from those interpretations, we try to build theories, essentially, about how things came about. But in fact, in this case, it's very difficult to know. There's no way that we can possibly know at this point where life came from. We do have evidence for early fossils 3.5 billion years ago. So this is going to be Betty Crocker's Cookbook Part 2. This is going to be the experiments and the ingredients for life. Okay, so did life come from outer space or did it come from Earth? And we're also going to talk about some of the early arguments about how life first evolved on this planet. And so that's replicationists or metabolismists. So even Darwin, that guy who gave us that book on the origin of species in 1859, he proposed this idea of evolution. And he did it through his study of birds from the Galapagos Islands, but he came up with the idea that evolution can occur, that is, changes in gene frequency through time. We know that occurs, right? It happens all the time. It happens with like these variants that we see in the COVID-19 virus, okay? So that virus, in fact, changes quite rapidly because it goes through different hosts and it mutates. It doesn't really mutate, but it changes in some form or another. Darwin first came up with the idea that evolution occurred, and then these are ideas that have been around for a while, but he's the one that first put the evidence and said, look how this shows this. And that was with the beaks on the finches from the Galapagos Islands and the different kinds of birds. And so there was a founder species that eventually filled in all of the niches in the Galapagos Islands with different beak designs in order to be insectivores, seed crackers, nutcrackers, and that sort of evolution, if you will. He thought, however, and this was kind of a flawed concept, he thought it was what they called at the time survival of the fittest. And so the one that's best designed in order to fulfill that niche will rise to the top, and those gene preferences essentially that's really sexual preference, right? So what do you want in a mate, essentially? And so today we know that evolution occurs from four different types of processes that occur in evolution. That is genetic drift. That's within a population. You can get a frequency that'll go in one direction or another, maybe taller people, maybe shorter people in some places like islands, right? And so and then we also know that there are spontaneous sort of types of changes in the DNA that are mutations in the genes. So those mutations, in fact, there's 4 different types of mutations as well that can lead to some sort of change in the genetic makeup, if you will. And then also there is gene flow. If we have separate populations, that there would be some transfer from across those barriers in order to have flow from one area to another area. So this is the United States of America, and many of us are mutts. Okay, so I have heritage that comes from all over Western Europe and maybe some other places, even from Asia. So those are the sort of things that we know that can happen in populations, and so it would be a combination of all 4 of these different types of evolutionary processes. So, but those are the 4 main ones that people refer to: genetic drift, mutations, gene flow, and then natural selection. The natural selection, of course, fits into the preference that you would have to pass on your traits on to the next generation. He wrote in a letter. This is Darwin. Darwin was writing to one of his colleagues, and he said, "But if we could conceive of some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts," he's thinking about the early Earth, "light, heat, electricity, etc. present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still yet more complex changes." And so what he was describing there has been called the hypothesis about how we could get an origin of life on this planet, the warm little pond, or a warm little pond. And expanding upon that idea, in the 1920s and all the way into the 1950s, both of these guys lived long enough to see their ideas proposed even farther. Alexander Oparin, who was a Russian biochemist, he came up with this idea that you could take methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water, and if you had the right sort of conditions around it, that you could actually spontaneously form a colloidal lipid. Now, lipids are like fats, essentially. Okay, those kind of molecules could form naturally, is what Oparin was saying. And so this is an idea that draws off of that warm little pond, and it's called the idea of primordial soup. So I use the Campbell's soup there. You can't find that in the stores. Okay, so if you do find it, probably don't eat it. Okay, so primordial soup is that idea that we had a warm little pond full of chemicals. And so those chemicals, in fact, would allow maybe more complex chemicals to then form. John Haldane was from Oxford. He was a Brit. And in 1929, he proposed essentially the same hypothesis. And so what he said was that you could have ammonia, and then you also have these lipids, okay, so you can actually form things out of hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide. Their hypotheses differed a little bit in detail, but at the same time today we lump them together because really what they're talking about is taking a chemical soup and giving a little spark of energy to it in order to form more complex sort of things. And so he said hydrogen sulfide, which is a common natural gas from decay and so forth, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen, sulfates, iron sulfides, etc. We didn't have any oxygen in the early atmosphere, however, so that would be a sort of difficulty that would take photosynthesizing organisms to be able to make that oxygen. With the idea that a primordial soup may have been the place where we had the first origination of life. Okay, so along comes a student at the University of Chicago. His name was Stanley Lloyd Miller. Stanley Miller approached one of his professors. It was a very famous professor, in fact. His professor was Harold Urey. Harold Urey had come up with, had discovered, in fact, one of the early chemicals that we realize was sort of an unusual molecule, I guess you could say. It's called deuterium. Deuterium is what we refer to as heavy water. Deuterium is a hydrogen molecule that has two parts to it in its nucleus, and so it would have a proton and a neutron together. If you have a proton and two neutrons, that's called tritium, and tritium is what they use in originally they used that in the manufacture of hydrogen bombs, and so, but deuterium is similar to that, and I think you could also use deuterium to manufacture hydrogen bombs as well, fusion bombs. So Harold Urey won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1934 based on his understanding of deuterium, and so people recognized his contributions. He's at the University of Chicago. His student comes up to him and he says, I'd like to see if we can't try to generate some complex molecules based on an experiment, a closed loop essentially. And so what we want to do is to have warm water. He wanted to replicate the conditions that were in the warm little pond. And so he says we can introduce the chemicals into it in gaseous form. We can get this experiment going. We can run it for a few weeks and see what we get. And he added a spark to it as well to imitate like lightning strikes that might essentially cause, well, the spark of life, right? So he says, can we actually replicate the sort of things, the conditions that might have been in that warm little pond? And so people really didn't like this idea at all. Because, well, Harold Urey thought it was kind of a waste of time, right? Why spend so much time and energy trying to make, but he said, okay, we'll agree to it and we'll run this experiment. But it was Stanley Lloyd Miller who came up with it's like, okay, well, he's the one that got picked on then kind of for saying, you're trying to create life, you know? And it's like that was seen as a sort of Frankenstein sort of like adventure at that time, so probably not a good thing. And so anyway, that was mostly folks who were in various faiths said, that's a sacred sort of thing. You can't be making experiments that try to make life. Well, of course, he wasn't trying to make life. He was trying to make complex molecules out of simpler molecules. And so that experiment got run. And so they ran it for 1 week. And this is the experiment right here. This is the design for it, right? So you boil a little bit of water, not really boiling, just heat it up, in fact. And so you get steam out of that. The evaporation comes out of that. You take out all the excess air, make sure everything's sterile, I guess, when you first started as well. And then they had a cold water condenser to so if it's overheated or whatever. And in the presence of those gases, what they did was run that spark through there. And what they found was 10 to 15% of the carbon was in complex organic molecules after they ran this for just 1 week. And so people have done this experiment repeatedly over time, and it always shows up that you get various things. And so even the glass material, I read a recent article, I think it was in Science or it may have been in Nature, but it was all, even the type of glass that you used in here had an influence on the type of results that you got from this experiment. And so when they had a trap at the very bottom of this and they tried to figure out exactly what they had made by running this loop like this, they found that they had hydrogen cyanide, formaldehyde, glycine, which is an important one, and ribose, which is a type of sugar in that trap. So glycine is an amino acid. It's one of the things that is a building block of proteins. And proteins, in fact, then become the building blocks of life. So, it actually ran. It was something that people still do, in fact. So they'll run this. Recently, there was an interview. I'm going to try to post it. I'll try to find it, but it was on NPR. So in that primordial soup, Miller and Urey at the University of Chicago showed that amino acids can arise from these chemical reactions. Amino acids are the key building blocks of proteins. So that's one idea. You could have this sort of like early ocean, essentially, that provided hydrogen cyanide, you have carbon dioxide, you have the water, you have the methane that's available there as well. All of these from volcanic sort of sources likely and in the water, and you can form these organic monomers, or actually they're an amino acid that you could form from that. And from those amino acids, you could use those as building blocks for proteins, which are going to be part of the structure of some living organism. Now, that was one hypothesis. The other hypothesis had been known for a long time, that people thought that maybe you could bring this stuff in from outer space. And it was Arrhenius, the Swedish chemist, who first proposed that in any sort of organized way. But it had been known all the way back since the ancient Greeks. They knew about thunderstones, and so thunderstones could come from outer space. And of course, with lightning and things like that, you can have all sorts of different kinds of types of molecules that could actually form from outer space. Do you get things from outer space that would be possible to build living life forms out of? In fact, yes. We get amino acids in meteorites. Meteorites contain amino acids. Well, where did that come from? Well, it came from another planet at some point. We don't, the meteorites that we know of that have amino acids probably come from outside of our solar system. So if that's the case, there could be life all over our galaxy and maybe the entire universe for all we know. And that if you break those planets apart, that eventually those molecules that were the building blocks of life on some other planet would be incorporated then into that meteorite. We've already seen evidence for graphite on Earth, right? That's carbon too, but it's in amino acids, it's a little bit more complex than that. So let me first describe what we're really talking about here. Meteoroids are a type of thing flying around in outer space. It's a chunk of rock in outer space. When that enters the atmosphere, it actually begins to burn a little bit, and so it actually oxidizes and actually causes the show that we see. We call them shooting stars, right? Well, those light shows, in fact, are what we are referring to as meteors. So meteor is what that is. An astrobleme is where one gets close enough to the Earth that it actually explodes and makes what we call a fireball. And so that's an astrobleme. And then lastly, if a chunk of rock that had come from outer space as a meteoroid had entered into the Earth's atmosphere and actually made it to the Earth's surface, we call those things meteorites. And so a meteorite is the last bit that we can see. We can actually pick it up on the Earth's surface then. So we have different kinds of meteorites, okay? So we have ones that represent probably the core of another planet, and that would be the iron-nickel meteorites. And so that's from the core of some asteroid, perhaps. And so we like to think that the asteroid belt, in fact, are the remains of some planet that's been torn apart by the gravitational effects of Jupiter. So iron-nickel meteorites probably come from the asteroid belt mostly. We also get stony iron meteorites from the asteroid belt as well, and chunks of iron and nickel meteorites and also stony meteorites are found where there are conglomerations essentially from the impact of these things hitting each other. So stony iron meteorites probably come from the mantle of another planet, and then the stony meteorites as well. So the core mantle boundary would be the stony iron, and then the stony meteorites would be the mantle part of this other planet that would have existed in our solar system. But then we also get these other kinds. The other kinds are called carbonaceous chondrites. And so carbonaceous chondrites are little tiny little globules of material essentially that come from what we think is part of the primordial dust cloud that we had, that from which the solar system had formed. So in those meteorites that are carbonaceous chondrites, and they're relatively rare, those carbonaceous chondrites, like the one on the right-hand side here, those things have amino acids in them. So if you have amino acids in a meteorite, there may well have been life somewhere else on this planet. At least that's the hypothesis. And so that hypothesis, in fact, is referred to as panspermia. So panspermia is this idea that life could have originated somewhere else in the universe and been brought here, hitchhiked along on a meteorite, boom, hits the Earth, and then would have seeded itself into the oceans that existed on this planet. Conditions were right. And the next thing you know, you're beginning to form from those amino acids proteins, and those proteins would in fact form things that are more complex and probably giving us eventually prokaryotes. If you run the experiment enough millions and billions of years, it's like the monkeys in a room with a typewriter. Eventually they're going to come up with, Shakespeare. That's not necessarily the case, obviously, but it depends on. I guess we like to say that sometimes things become more complex through time just based on the experiment being run again and again and again and again. Okay, is there evidence of life on other planets? And so this gets into some tricky sort of situations here. In 1994, I think it was proposed by a scientist with NASA. His name was McKay. He said, I think I found evidence for life on the planet Mars. And so there was a meteorite that was collected from Antarctica. It was from the Allen Hills in Antarctica. And I have to understand, Allen Hills are sort of a barrier mountain range in Antarctica. And the East Antarctic ice sheet actually ablates right at the foot of the Allen Hills. And so it's a great place to look for meteorites. So because the ice wears away there from the natural processes, meteorites are continuously being brought up, essentially in a conveyor belt. So if a meteorite strikes the East Antarctic ice sheet, you might find it in places like the Allen Hills. And they found a meteorite there in 1984 that had all the signature, all the things that you could see on the rock that indicated that it probably came from Mars. Now, we've seen Martian rocks before, and these are the same types of rocks that you would see on Mars. I think it's called, it's not encrianite, but it has a certain name to that type of meteorite. So this is not a carbonaceous chondrite, I guess is what I'm saying. But when they examined this rock, so they bring these rocks back from Antarctica, they take them to a lab, and then they try to test them geochemically and everything. Well, this is one they actually put under a scanning electron microscope to see what they could see on the rock itself, and they found some carbon tubes on it. Well, you may recall what we saw with the carbon tubes in the charts that we looked at, right? So for the ones from the Pilbara And so things like the apex chert and other sorts of cherts that we looked at, in this case, we're actually looking at the carbon tube itself. And so here you can see David McKay from NASA, and he proposed this, like, I think that we found the relics of life from a Martian meteorite, and so that would mean that there's life on Mars. This was such a popular idea at the time that actually President Clinton, who was the president at that time, actually made an announcement from the White House to say, I think we found the remains of life on another planet. And so they wanted to fund, of course, NASA for their experiments and everything. This tube fits the mold for what we understand from those tubes that we saw in the Barberton and the fig tree chert, and then also from the cherts from the apex chert. And these carbon tubes are 20 to 100 microns in length here. And so it was very controversial, however. You guys already have a little bit of experience knowing that life can exist in a lot of different places. And in fact, I told you about Endolithic algae. And so would it surprise us to see something that was in Antarctic rock, in a rock that may have been in outer space and come from Mars, but anyway, when it lands on planet Earth, that you might in fact still infect it with life forms that live in Antarctica, these extremophiles that live in the ice or live in the borders of rocks. And so it doesn't surprise me that we might in fact have had some contamination right there in Antarctica based on what we see here. So anyway, McKay has said that, in fact, he still thinks that those things, in 2009, he published again. It's like, I still think that these things are actually a relic of life from another planet. And we may have life on Mars, for all we know. It may have been there at one time anyway, because we know that Mars had many of the conditions that we have on Earth. We had oceans on Mars that eventually would, disappear from the lack of an atmosphere to keep those oceans there. But this is still very controversial, and most people have landed on the side that's like, well, this really isn't evidence of life on Mars. But it does keep us thinking all the time. When people propose these ideas, we have to test those ideas. And that's really the science part. Do we, or can we actually get in and disprove the idea that life was on Mars? And so that's a much more difficult feat to try to undertake. Okay, so if we fast forward a little bit, Sidney Fox in the 1950s and 1960s, he says, okay, so you can get these amino acids. We know that. You can spontaneously form things from amino acids then. So he did a further experiment where he was able to form peptides. Now, peptides are similar to proteins, but they're a little bit shorter molecule, and so proteins can be folded and so forth, right? So that's kind of what viruses are, right? So they're just folded proteins for the most part. Sidney Fox came along and he says, yeah, we can make these peptides, and so you can make more complex sort of things out of simple amino acids. In the 1980s, the argument was put forward. It's like, okay, well, there are two things that we got to get out of life. We have to be able to replicate. Otherwise, it's not going to stay living beyond one organism, and then it's going to be gone and have to be replicated in some other way, abiotically again. So, in fact, there were other people that said, no, but you have to metabolize first in order to be a living, right? And so those are the two schools of thought that have to compete with one another. And so the replicationists and then the metabolismists argue about where are you going to form life once you get it here. You have the right chemicals and everything. How are you going to organize it? How are you going to get these things to line up and form these more complex molecules? And that's when people began to realize that maybe the most lowly form of life forms could actually have been precipitated in the openings between mineral grains. Now, you guys got to see this when you looked at the life's rocky start, and you got to see the influence of clays in that presentation. So if we could actually get the peptides and the proteins to line up, we could actually make more complex molecules. And so you can do that perhaps with minerals that have unsatisfied charges on their surfaces. And so montmorillonite is one of those clay minerals. Now, montmorillonite is a silicate mineral. regarded as a clay mineral. Clay minerals are a lot like micas. Micas have sheets of sheets of mineral layers that have a cleavage. And so if you take a mica that has one layer of cleavage like this, you could peel that off. And if you were to do that, let's say if you've taken Geology 110, or if you're interested in this class and you say, I want to be a geologist after this, I was like, you can actually take mica from the labs and you can peel off one layer at a time of mica and you'll hear it go. It's the static electricity. There are unsatisfied charges on either side of those plates, those cleavage planes. And so the same thing goes for clay minerals. So clay minerals have unsatisfied charges. What that means is there's a plus and a minus side. If you put a molecule in a conditions, under the right conditions, wet and also with plus and minus, water already is a polar molecule. Water has a plus side and water has a minus side. So water, because of that property, has what we call surface tension. So surface tension is this idea that water molecules line up with the pluses attracted to the minuses, and they'll all line up one another. You can show that, in fact, if you put a drop of water on a table, you can actually see the water droplet itself will form this sort of rounded feature. Well, that's okay. If we didn't know about science, we would think that it's magical. Why does water always do that? And alcohol does not. So alcohol will just, and flatten out across that surface. Well, water has surface tension. That's why. So if you have surface tension, those water molecules are pulling like this. And so if you have unsatisfied charges on either side of that water molecule, the water is going to line up, and then so too would the peptides, so would the proteins. And so you may form more complex things in a charged system where you have the presence of water like that. So this is a SEM photograph of what it looks like to be on the surface of a clay mineral. So that's a clay mineral right there. So with that in mind, we've proposed the two different varieties of origins for life on this planet. Either it could have formed here in some warm little pond, or it could have been brought in from outer space in carbonaceous chondrites that delivered some amino acids that eventually got into that warm little pond, because we know that we had the warm little pond at some point during, probably before the Archean, probably at the end of the Hadean. So are there other lines of evidence that we have? Well, some people think that you could also have life could have formed spontaneously in places like from abiogenesis. Again, things that weren't living provide the right chemicals in order for life to form spontaneously. And deep sea vents and all of these extremophiles that we looked at in the earliest of these presentations, they all have that capacity for potentially giving us life forms. So deep sea vents, you can get iron and sulfur being the principal driving component for giving us that. Remember in the Urey, the Miller-Urey experiment, they had to have an approximation for lightning, so they had to give a charge essentially to line things up. Other ideas, some people think that you have to have energy, right, in order to form these things. And so radioactive beach, we have radioactive materials on this planet. We have a beach that delivers energy. It's being bombarded by ultraviolet radiation from the early sun. It's the right temperature to form things. You can self-organize. Even tidal energy and wave energy could actually have been components in trying to drive things to become more complex. And so these are usually put into the metabolismist thought, or a school of thought anyway, for how you first begin to form these organisms. Replication is a little bit more difficult process. And so many more hypotheses have been proposed by replicationists for this abiogenic sort of rise of life on this planet. I can't tell you which one's right. Is it from outer space or is it from that warm little pond? It came from the warm little pond, we're sure, in the case of stromatolites, but how did it first get there? How did we get those prokaryotes into the warm little pond? Where did they evolve first? Well, we don't know. Maybe someday we're going to figure this out, but I tell you, I'm a little skeptical. That's what we do in science. We're skeptical pretty much about everything, especially when people propose that we have carbon tubes that came from Mars. And so, yeah, I'm not so much for that idea, but we have to keep looking. Unless you look, how would you even know that there were tubes on it, right? And so, yeah, so keep the gears cranking up there and try to figure out these things. If you don't have them on the front of your mind, you're never going to figure it out. So if we talk about the origin of life on this planet, that's a tough question to ask. It's much, much easier, in fact, to try to figure out exactly where humans came from. We came from other living organisms, okay? So we're going to get to that eventually here. So that's pretty much it for this presentation. I'm going to have to go in and edit out my little interruptions here, but other than that, I think that is enough to finish this off, and I'll talk to you soon here.